In the second year of liking Robert, I decided to give up. I changed my seat, stopped speaking to him, and maintained a distance. At that moment, my suitable childhood friend transferred to our school. I attended school and returned home with my childhood friend. Inseparable. Someone jokingly asked Robert, "Robert, that troublesome young lady Rebecca has finally let you go and switched her focus. How do you feel about that?" Robert remained silent. It was only after I withdrew from the club I had initially joined for him that he coldly looked at me and asked, "Rebecca, do you wealthy families always act so whimsically, with a fleeting enthusiasm for everything?" Chapter 01. Before Martin transferred here, I was on the verge of giving up on Robert. In fact, it was merely a momentary decision. That day, I was standing at the back door of the club when I overheard someone joking with Robert. "No, Robert, why are you still trying to study? Does Rebecca like you? Do you even know her family background?" As soon as she entered the school, her father donated a building to the institution, worried that she wouldn't adapt to the cafeteria. So, he built her another one, hiring Michelin star chefs. I heard she's an only child. If she likes you, you could save yourself 60 years of hard work. Yes, you're still ignoring her. Have you lost your mind? You can't possibly hate her, can you? After a long while, I finally heard Robert's cold voice, suppressing a deep impatience as he said, "Yes, I absolutely hate her. I would rather struggle for 80 more years than take the shortcut she offers." Inside, they laughed exaggeratedly together, and I heard the sound of mocking laughter. I stood quietly outside the door for several seconds, then lowered my hand that was about to push the door open and turned to leave. To be honest, before hearing this conversation today, I had no idea that Robert hated me so deeply. I keep recalling the profound disdain in his tone when he spoke, constantly wondering what I did to evoke such loathing from him. I admit I had feelings for Robert. During my teenage years, who hasn't had a crush on the handsome, academically accomplished boy at school? However, I never harassed Robert or clung to him. I simply offered my modest assistance a few times. The first time I saw him was actually on the school's honor wall. My father accompanied me to school and, upon seeing Robert's photo on the bulletin board, casually remarked, "Hey, daughter, I must say, the top student at your school is quite handsome." That young man, following my father's gaze, my first impression of Robert was indeed that he was a very handsome academic achiever. Later, during class registration, I discovered that he was in the same class as I. At that moment, my father was quite pleased to see him. He casually patted Robert on the shoulder, gave him a thumbs up, and praised, "Young man, you must be the one at the top of the honor wall at school. Excellent. Excellent." As Robert's peer, I find it rather annoying when strangers engage in overly familiar conversations. My father has always lacked a sense of personal space. Decades ago, when he was young and working in sales, he could chat with a stray dog on the street for an hour. I awkwardly smiled at Robert to indicate I was interrupting, but Robert looked over with a cold gaze. He wasn't displeased by the stranger's interruption. He simply smiled politely at my father and then lowered his head to thank him courteously. This scene caught the attention of my homeroom teacher, who seemed to take a liking to it. So the teacher arranged for Robert and me to be desk partners. At the beginning, my relationship with Robert was actually quite good. He would explain problems to me, and during PE class, he would drag my lifeless self across the finish line when we ran the 800 meters. Sometimes during breaks, I would ask him to bring me a bottle of water from the vending machine, and occasionally, when I was secretly reading a novel under my textbook during class, he would cover for me. However, after class, he would always disdainfully say to me, "Rebecca, you're so lazy and useless. Your grades are poor. Your stamina is lacking. What are you going to do in the future?" While coldly explaining problems to me and giving me extra lessons, I always gazed at him with a carefree smile, saying, "Aren't you still here, my top student desk mate? If I can't make it, I'll come running to you. I want to cling to your thigh. You won't be able to shake me off." Robert looked at me intently. His eyes were beautiful, a light amber color, reminiscent of the cat's eye stone I played with as a child, the kind that seems to draw you in if you stare too long. I inexplicably blushed and then began to stutter. A smile flickered across Robert's face and then vanished. And he returned to his usual expression, lowering his head to explain the concepts to me. Before anyone knew that my father was the wealthiest man in City A, Robert and I were just like any ordinary desk mates, getting along very harmoniously and amicably. He began to distance himself from me, likely starting with the post titled "Let's Uncover the Family Background of Rebecca" from Class 6 of the first year. This post stated that the new building at school was donated by my father, and that the reasonably priced cafeteria in the West District was specifically constructed for me by my father, with the low prices being a result of my father personally covering the costs. Furthermore, when the cafeteria is packed, there is a private room reserved solely for me. I use it when I dine there, and when I do not, the room remains perpetually closed. These details are somewhat exaggerated. My father donated the building because he values cultural knowledge and education. As someone who grew up in a humble background, he understands the significance of education. The cafeteria was not constructed specifically for me. He believes that students need adequate nutrition during his school days. Due to financial difficulties, his meals consisted of merely a steamed bun and a bottle of chili sauce. To put it in my father's words, "Once you have money, you should give back to society in a timely manner." I hope today's students do not have to endure the same hardships he faced. This post has gained traction, and more familiar classmates have come to ask me, "Rebecca, is what that post says true?" It has left me feeling quite frustrated. I had no choice but to complain to Robert. He sat next to me, quietly reading with his head down. Robert is very smart. He can multitask quite well. In the past, I didn't dare to talk to him while he was reading, but he himself said it was fine. Such simple problems and my meaningless nonsense are not something he would struggle to differentiate. Later, I specifically asked him questions while he was working on complex math problems. He was able to answer me while performing intricate calculations on scratch paper. However, that day, after I finished speaking, he suddenly interrupted me with an impatient and very cold demeanor, his tone icy as he said, "Rebecca, can you please not bother me?" My complaint came to an abrupt halt, caught in my throat. I was actually feeling a bit sad at that moment, but after a pause, I felt somewhat embarrassed and apologized to him, saying, "I'm sorry, Robert. Is this problem very difficult? Then I won't bother you anymore." However, later on, even when he wasn't reading or doing exercises, he remained cold when I spoke to him, and gradually, I lost the desire to talk to him as well. Thus, we fell into an inexplicable Cold War. Although we didn't draw a dividing line on the table, it was still quite childish. He wouldn't speak to me, and I wouldn't speak to him, like elementary school students having a quarrel. But he was always a big, silent gourd, so the one truly suffering was probably just me. Chapter 02. Our relationship completely soured, likely because the homeroom teacher initiated a fundraiser for Robert in class. Prior to this, I was not particularly aware of Robert's family circumstances. Due to his school uniform, along with his handsome appearance, excellent academic performance, and composed demeanor, it was difficult to imagine that he came from a single-parent household, where his mother suffered from kidney disease and required costly dialysis treatments each month. The homeroom teacher stood at the podium and stated, "Student Robert is exceptionally talented. Despite facing such challenging circumstances, he has managed to maintain impressive grades." Therefore, upon learning about Robert's situation, the school has decided to organize a collective fundraising initiative for Robert's family. We hope everyone can embody the spirit of unity and compassion, assisting the remarkable Robert in overcoming this adversity. Robert is very well liked. He is hardworking, exceptional, mature, composed, and handsome, which prompts everyone to emit a sigh of regret and then turn to look at Robert. I felt a heaviness in my heart, and I couldn't care less whether I was still in a Cold War with Robert. I turned my head to look at Robert and quietly asked him, "Why have you never mentioned this before?" He lowered his head to read, his lips pressed tightly together in a straight line, remaining silent. At that moment, I didn't think much of it. I considered Robert to be my friend, or at least I thought so unilaterally. I didn't take into account the boy's pride or anything. I simply wanted to help him solve his problem. So, I went to find my dad. My dad acted swiftly. He even covered Robert's expenses from high school through college without requiring the school to make a donation. He also leveraged his connections to transfer Robert's mother to a private hospital, with all costs charged to his account. The day Robert and his mother came to my house to thank my dad was a weekend. My dad and I had just returned home, and they were standing in front of the archway outside our villa. The sun was shining brightly, and as soon as my dad got out of the car, Robert's mother knelt before him. She expressed her desire to thank my father for his immense kindness and virtue. Robert was dressed in the school's white uniform, supporting his mother. My father felt somewhat embarrassed and quickly went to assist her. Robert's mother grasped my father's hand and said, "Woo, we could never repay your immense kindness and virtue, even if we worked like oxen or horses. From now on, Robert is yours. You may command him as you wish." I trailed behind my father, feeling somewhat dazed and at a loss. As my gaze flicked past Robert, he coincidentally looked up at me, his eyes deep and dark like an unfathomable abyss. He simply stared at me. I don't know why, but at that moment, I felt that something had vanished from Robert. Although he had always been mature beyond his years, handling people and situations with composure, there were still times when he displayed the spirit of youth. However, that youthful spirit now seems to have disappeared. His maturity is more pronounced, and he has become even more taciturn. I realized too late that he probably doesn't want me here at this moment. Later, I made a concerted effort to mend the relationship between Robert and me. Every morning, I brought him breakfast and bought him water after class. I did this even when I wasn't Rebecca, and Robert never acted ungrateful. However, ever since I became Rebecca, he no longer accepts these gestures from me. It's as if accepting is equivalent to receiving charity. But this is clearly just a friendly gesture between friends sitting at the same table. How costly can a bit of breakfast and a bottle of water be? On his birthday, I gave him a pair of shoes, and he didn't accept those either. Later on, rumors spread about my secret crush on Robert. I never denied them or offered an explanation, because I can't claim to have been completely forthright about my feelings for Robert, and I thought that Robert at least liked me. After all, his previous indulgence and care for me were unique exceptions. That was until I overheard him saying those things outside the rock climbing club. He said, "Yes, I really hate her." Fine. Although I truly want to mend my relationship with Robert, I also understand that a gentleman does not force others. If he hates me, then so be it. One's heart should be like a bamboo forest, rustling in the wind, returning to normal as soon as the wind ceases. He hates me, then I won't like him anymore. Chapter 03. When Robert returned, I was already sitting calmly in my seat. I haven't attempted to speak with Robert since the day his mother thanked my father. Regardless of how cold his demeanor towards me was, I would strain to find topics to discuss with him every day. But now, I no longer wish to search for topics. In truth, I don't have much of a temper. I've always been a silly and cheerful person, rarely engaging in disputes. All the elders remarked on my good temperament when I was young. However, even a clay figurine has its limits. When Robert sat down, I even shifted slightly to the side, creating some distance between us. Robert's body seemed to stiffen, and I could sense his confusion as he glanced over at me. However, I kept my head down, engrossed in my book, not even daring to glance in his direction. During math class, I zoned out for a moment, just as the teacher was analyzing a problem and called on me to stand up and answer. I stammered while looking at the problem on the board, and Robert pushed his draft paper over, placing it right under my nose. Our little actions were actually quite evident to everyone on the podium, yet the teacher chose not to intervene. Robert meticulously wrote each step, as if he feared I wouldn't comprehend. I hesitated for a moment, looked up at the math teacher, and said, "I'm sorry, teacher, I didn't understand." The math teacher was momentarily taken aback, then addressed the class, saying, "Let me explain it again. Other students who didn't understand should pay attention and not daydream. Learning is your own responsibility. Rebecca, you may sit down now." As I sat down with my eyes cast down, I noticed Robert's hand, which was gripping the pen, momentarily pause. He must have exerted some effort, as the knuckles of his fingers gripping the ballpoint pen turned white. After a considerable time, He silently retrieved the draft book that had been in front of me. I didn't speak to him. This continued until the end of class. In truth, I felt a bit sad inside, although I had resolved to do something. Robert was still sitting next to me. He was such a large person, with a presence so strong that it was difficult to ignore. I thought that after some time, I could speak to the teacher and request a seat change, so I wouldn't have to sit next to Robert anymore. I just needed to find a suitable reason. I couldn't appear too obvious. I was lost in thought when suddenly someone knocked on my window, saying someone was looking for me. The two girls who knocked on the window were making faces at me, laughing as they said, "Wow, Rebecca, he's quite the handsome guy. You should come out." I find myself inexplicably confused. It was only after I stepped outside that I saw the handsome guy standing in the corridor outside the classroom. He was quite tall, leaning against the wall, dressed not in a school uniform but in a white shirt, with striking features. People in the corridor kept glancing at him with curiosity, yet he remained calm and composed, not casting a sideways glance. Only when I curiously looked up at him did a faint smile appear at the corner of his mouth as he gently called my name, Rebecca. "Ah!" I suddenly exclaimed, then excitedly took 2 steps toward him, grabbed his arm, and eagerly asked, "Martin, when did you come back?" He looked down at me and smiled gently, saying, "Just a week ago. I returned to handle some matters in the country, and today I finally completed the transfer procedures. From now on, I will be your senior, so I wanted to come and say hello." I was very excited. Transfer? Did Uncle and Aunt return to the country as well? He looked at my expression and smiled, saying, "Yes, this time we are settling down, and there's no need to go abroad anymore." I gazed at his surprised smile. "Martin, who lived next door when I was a child, was there during a time when my father had just started his business and was extremely busy. Every day, I was entrusted to the care of Martin's mother next door, and sometimes when she went out, it was Martin, the older brother, who looked after me. Although we are of similar age, my family still possesses an album featuring a photograph of him as a toddler, standing unsteadily beside my crib, holding a bottle to feed me. In later years, he took me climbing trees to search for bird nests, shared stories with me daily, and took me out to play, much like a real brother would. For many years, our families have been neighbors, maintaining a very close relationship, until 5 years ago when Martin's father was promoted and became a foreign diplomat, relocating the entire family abroad. I cried for several nights while clinging to Martin, and when he was leaving on the plane, I went to see him off. I heard my father say that I was holding on to his sleeve and refusing to let go, nearly causing him to miss his flight. Later, he frequently sent me things, and we maintained intermittent contact, although it certainly hasn't been as frequent as it used to be over the past 2 years. I didn't expect him to suddenly return to the country. It must be that Martin's dad has been promoted again. In fact, I had already spoken to Uncle Wu about it a month ago. I didn't want him to tell you because I wanted to surprise you by suddenly appearing in front of you. He smiled, patted my head, and said, "All right, hurry back to the classroom. I still have some paperwork to take care of. I'll come pick you up after school, and we'll go back together." I responded with an and only reluctantly let go of his hand when the class bell rang. Walking towards the classroom, on my way back to my seat, I couldn't suppress the smile at the corners of my lips. I raised my eyes to look at my seat and unexpectedly caught Robert's gaze as he withdrew it from the window. His eyes were cold, staring at me with a frosty expression, even worse than during our previous Cold War. He simply stared at the smile on my face with a blank expression. I was taken aback. He didn't move an inch until I reached him. My seat was inside his, and since he didn't move, I couldn't get in. I said, "Robert, could you please make way?" He lowered his head as if he hadn't heard anything, remaining motionless. He had never behaved this way before, and I didn't know why he was unhappy again or what I had done to upset him. The class bell had already rung for the 2nd time, and the teacher was about to arrive. I felt a bit anxious and couldn't help but raise my voice, saying, "Robert." Suddenly, he smiled softly, with a hint of mockery, saying, "So, you're finally willing to talk to me?" Then he leaned forward slightly, allowing me to walk in behind him and sit down before the teacher arrived. He was acting a bit strangely. I turned my head to look at Robert. He was already staring ahead, back to his usual self. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but after thinking it over, I swallowed my question. Never mind. Forget it. It has nothing to do with me, and I won't ask anymore. Chapter 04. Martin has become my senior, and it feels as if I have returned to 5 years ago. Back then, he was the same, coming to my house every morning to wait for me so we could go to school together. And after class, he would pick me up at the door of my classroom, and we would walk home together. Every day after class, when Martin waited for me at the classroom door, the girls in the class would let out exaggerated wow sounds, then excitedly tease me, saying, "Rebecca, your Martin is here again." Of course, there were also some gossipers who asked me, "Rebecca, what is your relationship with Martin?" I sighed and explained, "He lives next door to me, just returned from abroad, like my brother. You all shouldn't make a fuss." However, my explanation seemed to excite everyone even more, as they elongated their tones and said, "He rides a bamboo horse, circling around you. The green plums are not yet ripe, but feelings have already blossomed. So you two are childhood sweethearts? Then Martin's family must be quite well off, right? Handsome and wealthy. Rebecca, you two are a match made in heaven." I didn't know what to say, even though I've said countless times that my relationship with Martin is purely sibling-like. No one believes me. The pop of the ballpoint pen in Robert's hand next to me snapped in half, blue ink oozing from the nib and staining his hands. The girl in front of me exchanged glances, and the teasing subsided until Robert, with a blank expression, said, "Could you please make way? I need to wash my hands." When he returned from washing his hands, the classmates who had been teasing me had also dispersed. Robert looked at me and, with an expressionless face, said, "Could you all gossip somewhere else or change places? It's very noisy." Whether I was passive or active, disturbing others is never good. So I lowered my head and apologized to him, saying, "I'm sorry." Robert stared at me in surprise, his expression somewhat uncomfortable. The coldness on his face gradually softened, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but for some reason, he held back. I could sense him gazing at me, lost in thought. After a brief pause, I looked up at him and mustered the courage to say, "It's not good for you to be disturbed while studying every day. Robert, I will speak to the homeroom teacher later and ask him to change my seat." Upon hearing this, Robert looked at me, his previously softened expression inexplicably hardened again, and he stared at me blankly. After a long silence, he coldly replied, "Do as you wish." The next day, I changed my seat. The homeroom teacher, somewhat concerned, asked me if I had a conflict with my classmates. After a moment of thought, I explained that I didn't want to disturb Robert's studies. Robert is the homeroom teacher's prized student, and since it pertains to his grades, the teacher readily agreed. He inquired where I would like to sit. Robert's seat is on the left side by the window. He enjoys the sunlight and the breeze. After some consideration, I requested the teacher to move me to the far right, next to the outer aisle of the classroom, one on the west and one on the east, separated by 6 rows of distance. Now that we are so far apart, I believe Robert should be pleased. Robert's seat next to him has remained empty, as if the homeroom teacher had asked him whom he would like to sit with, and he coldly refused, stating that he preferred to sit alone. The homeroom teacher simply acquiesced. My new deskmate is a rather noisy chubby boy. He enthusiastically gossips with me, and compared to him, I hardly speak. He even shares the cake and chocolate he keeps in his desk with me, which is far better than Robert's cold, fish-like demeanor. However, sitting far away from Robert, I still feel disheartened, as if a significant part of my heart is empty. Only when the teacher calls him up to write 3 different solutions to an example problem can I openly gaze at his upright back in a daze. Robert and I found ourselves in this predicament. After we stopped sitting together, we became like the most familiar strangers. Oh, I even went to withdraw from the club I had originally joined for him. I don't like rock climbing. I initially joined just to get closer to him. On the day I withdrew from the club, Robert wore a blatant expression of mockery, while the others in the club held their breath, watching us in silence. Robert asked me, Rebecca, do you always do whatever you please? With a fleeting enthusiasm that lasts only 3 minutes. Before I could respond, he handed me the withdrawal application, coldly stating, "Sign it and return it to me." I took it over in silence. After that, we had no further intersections at all. As the days passed, my little sadness gradually healed, transforming into a carefree demeanor, as I laughed foolishly all day long. That was until Angelica transferred here. Chapter 05. Angelica was specifically recruited from another school to join ours. The first time I saw her was when she stood at the podium in our class to introduce herself, and she matched the image of a top student quite well. She had neatly cropped short hair and exuded a strong presence. After completing her self-introduction, she smiled brightly and directly met Robert's gaze, greeting him with, "Robert, it's been a long time." I felt a subtle tightening in my chest. Angelica became Robert's new desk mate. They must have encountered each other numerous times at various competition events and shared many common topics, which is why they appeared so familiar with one another. Every time there was a break between classes, whenever I accidentally glanced over there, I could see them quietly discussing something. Sometimes Robert would frown, while at other times, a faint smile would linger at the corners of his mouth. During the first provincial joint exam after Angelica turned around, the classmates in the class were very curious and placed a bet on who would score higher, Robert or Angelica. Later, when the results were announced, Robert still emerged victorious, but the score difference between Angelica and him was less than 20 points, whereas Robert's total score had previously been at least 100 points higher than that of the second-place student. He has virtually no weaknesses in his subjects. Someone compared and posted Robert and Angelica's scores in each subject on the classroom wall. In all the science subjects, they were nearly evenly matched, both close to full marks. Robert and Angelica's scores were the first to be released, likely because even the school's teachers were curious, prompting them to specifically select Robert and Angelica's papers for early grading. The other students' test papers were distributed the following day. Robert, the math class representative, unfortunately handed me my paper. As he approached my desk, I sensed he hesitated for a moment before placing my test paper down, marked with glaring red crosses and a large score of 68 out of a possible 150. I have never really cared much about grades. Even my father has never had high expectations for my studies. He simply hopes that I can live a happy and carefree life. Yet, for some reason, when I saw that big 68, I suddenly felt a wave of shame and frustration, especially under Robert's watchful gaze. Sure enough, I heard Robert's mocking voice as he said, "Rebecca, are you really planning to use this score to get into college?" This was the first time he had spoken to me since we stopped being desk mates. I silently folded the test paper and tucked it into my book, clearly signaling that I did not want to talk. Yet, for some reason, Robert did not leave. He stood in front of my desk and said, "If you have questions about the problems you don't understand, you can ask me." After a pause, he reiterated his explanation, "I am sponsored by Uncle Wu. If you have questions about the problems you don't understand, you can come and ask me." I remained silent. For some reason, Robert seemed a bit angry. He emphasized, indulging in distractions and lacking ambition. "Rebecca, do you plan to rely on your father for the rest of your life?" I finally looked up at him, feeling anger for the first time, and said, "What does it matter to you, Robert? Whether I rely on myself or my father is none of your business. Who are you to dictate my choices?" He paused, his pitch-black eyes gazing deeply into mine, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. Then he said nothing and walked away. On the way home that night, I remained silent, absent-mindedly kicking stones. Martin asked me if I was unhappy, and I shook my head, replying that I wasn't. It wasn't until Martin asked me about my plans for the future. I looked at him blankly, and Martin smiled at me, saying, "I still plan to study abroad. Becca, after I finish my exams this year, I will go abroad. I have suggested this to Uncle Wu. If you study abroad with me, I can look after you for a few years until you graduate." He smiled gently at me as he said this, then patted my head, saying, "The college entrance examination is not suitable for you, Rebecca. Uncle Shin thinks so too. He just hasn't mentioned it to you yet. Please consider it." Feeling somewhat frustrated, I asked him, "Brother Martin, am I really that inadequate?" He laughed, his hand gently resting on the top of my head, rubbing it as he said, "How could that be?" He wasn't being dismissive. Instead, he looked at me seriously and said, "Everyone has different skills and strengths. Rebecca, you simply don't have your skill points allocated to studying." I let out a sigh. After discussing it with my dad, he indeed has this intention. Initially, he was uneasy about me going abroad to study alone, but with Martin brother around, he feels much more at ease. I felt somewhat lost and helpless. My dad said, "Of course. Ultimately, it's your decision. I actually don't want you to go. If you take the college entrance exam here, regardless of how you perform, I have ways to get you into a good university. It's just that, Becca. Sometimes I wonder if I should let you go out on your own to gain some independence." He sighed wistfully, and I knew what he didn't say afterward. He worries that if he is not around in the future, I won't be independent enough and there will be no one to take care of me. I said, "Let me think about it, Dad." That night, I lay in bed tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Finally, just before I managed to drift off, I recalled Robert's words. He said, "Indulging in distractions leads to a lack of ambition." Rebecca, are you really planning to rely on your father for your entire life? So the next morning at breakfast, I told my dad that I wanted to go abroad to try something new, to become independent, and to embrace new experiences. My dad felt sentimental and reluctant, but more than that, he was proud. I have begun preparing my school applications and the necessary procedures for going abroad. I haven't mentioned this to anyone, partly because I struggle with the atmosphere of farewells. Although I have a carefree personality, I still feel somewhat lost when confronted with the sadness of parting. I am managing the procedures while attending classes. I just find myself visiting the teacher's office more frequently. By the time all the procedures are completed, I will have very little time left. Sometimes, I naively fantasize about secretly going abroad without telling Robert, so that one day when I suddenly disappear from school, he might inquire about me and discover that I have left without a word. I wonder if he would feel regret, pain, and sadness then. However, upon reflection, regardless of whether he later expressed his dislike for me to others, he did take care of me initially, and I genuinely considered him a friend. Leaving quietly like this seems somewhat rather impolite. I tried to put myself in his position, and I believe that even though our relationship is currently strained, if Robert were to leave for another country without saying a word to me, I would likely still feel quite sad. As I hesitated, I found myself nearing the time of departure. The night before I was set to leave, I finally resolved to return to the classroom during lunch break, where Robert typically liked to take a nap. However, when I arrived at the classroom, I discovered that he was not alone. Angelica was also present. The two of them stood side by side in front of the blackboard, each holding a piece of chalk, intensely discussing something. With a wall full of mathematical formulas behind them, Angelica was writing furiously on the blackboard, so caught up in her excitement that she forgot to watch her step. When she stepped off the edge, Robert cautioned her to be careful and reached out to grab her arm, pulling her towards him. The two of them were very close together. I stood in front of the window in the corridor and saw Angelica's face gradually turning red. After a moment, Robert released his grip on her arm, then turned his gaze away and calmly asked, "Are you okay?" Angelica shook her head. Even as an outsider, I could sense the ambiguous atmosphere. The two of them fell silent for a moment. Then, in perfect harmony, resumed discussing the problems on the blackboard. I hesitated, my footsteps softly retreating. They hardly paid attention. I thought he hadn't noticed why I had been visiting the teacher's office so frequently lately, nor had he realized my absences. He has a new desk mate, new friends, and they are evenly matched. Forget it. I turned and quietly walked away. Just as I had arrived. Chapter 06. By the time I was ready to return to my home country, it had already been 9 years. In fact, when I went abroad, no one anticipated that I would stay there for such an extended period. According to my father's perspective, the plan was to obtain a better university diploma abroad, then return home and, influenced by that experience, either take over his business if I found it appealing, or pursue something I enjoyed, like opening a shop. In summary, it was all about following my own preferences. Just make sure not to be idle. However, after spending 2 years in high school abroad, I graduated and entered Columbia University, which I certainly did not gain admission to through examinations. Once at university, I met many friends who were not academically inclined but were exceptionally skilled in certain areas. I began organizing niche art exhibitions because of a friend of mine. Her family background is not very affluent, and the exorbitant tuition and living expenses each year nearly leave her struggling to make ends meet. Nevertheless, the paintings she creates are stunning, featuring bold and vibrant colors, abstract lines, and bizarre expressions. Eventually, out of the blue, a few friends and I decided to find a venue to host a small exhibition for her. We selected the artworks and promoted them on social media, and to our surprise, we garnered a bit of attention. Several of my friends' paintings were even sold for a considerable price, and subsequently, my friends and I began to focus on galleries and art investment. We discover various emerging and lesser-known artists, assisting them in promoting their work through exhibitions and auctions. The value of art often appreciates based on the story behind it. We purchase promising pieces, package them, and then sell them for at least 10 times the original price. The scale is not very large. Some pieces yield good results while others do not. But overall, it has been quite successful. By my junior year, the money I earned was sufficient to fully cover my living expenses for that year. This experience provided me with a profound sense of achievement and satisfaction. After graduation, I founded an art investment company with a few friends and spent another 2 years abroad. In short, I no longer needed to ask my family for financial support. Then it came to the point where my dad urged me every day to return as soon as possible. Initially, when I had just arrived in a foreign land, I missed home and the delicious food from my country every day. My dad encouraged me to persevere. Later, after I graduated, he urged me to come back, but I was reluctant to leave the work I was doing with a group of like-minded friends, so I kept procrastinating month after month. However, recently, every time I called my dad, he didn't mention anything about my returning. That was until I received a call from home. My father is in the hospital. I have just come to realize many things I was previously unaware of. For instance, our family business has actually been quite difficult to manage over the past 2 years. The rise of live streaming has dealt a severe blow to the real economy, and the decline of real estate. My father has been enduring the pressure without informing me. This time, he fell ill while going to the bank to mortgage assets for cash flow. Perhaps the pressure was too overwhelming, or he was simply too exhausted and didn't rest properly. As he fainted the moment he stepped out of the car at home, when I rushed back to the country overnight, my father was still at home receiving 4 fluids. The family doctor was organizing the medical kit, and my father was half reclining on the bed. He appeared relatively well, though his face was somewhat pale and he had lost a bit of weight. When I saw his eyes, they filled with tears, and I shouted, "Dad!" My dad smiled at me and said, "Oh, I told you it's nothing. It's either low blood sugar or heat stroke." Later, I carefully consulted the doctor and confirmed that there was indeed no major issue before I felt at ease. My dad needs to rest, but his business contracts cannot be interrupted. There are many occasions where he must be present, so I have no choice but to represent him. Of course, I am not making decisions for him. I am merely representing his image to advance the collaborations he has already discussed with others, with his assistant guiding me along the way. I set down my luggage and, without even having time to adjust to the time difference, I plunged into a mountain of contract documents and data. After 3 days, I was feeling overwhelmed, and it was then that I truly grasped the hardships my father endured. The glamour seen by others, the warmth and coldness felt behind the scenes, are known only to oneself. Sometimes, when I sit by my father's bedside to share a meal with him, he sighs and looks at me, saying, "Once I feel a bit better and can manage some business, whether to sell or to handle it, it will probably be too late to let go when the time comes." I remained silent. My father has a few old friends in the industry who have gradually fallen on hard times. One uncle went bankrupt 2 years ago. My family is relatively well off because my father enjoys making broad investments, but our foundation is built on real estate, which is now deteriorating. If we don't cut off this rotten piece, all our assets could be dragged down with it. I understand my father's intention. He wants to quickly offload some assets to leave me with a sum of money, lest I end up with nothing but a pile of mess. I am weighed down by heavy thoughts, until the butler entered and informed my father that a student he had previously sponsored had heard about his illness and came to visit him. Chapter 07. When I first went abroad. I was young and even fantasized about the moment I would meet Robert upon my return. Without exception, I envisioned myself returning home from a position of superiority, while Robert stood before me, painfully asking, "Rebecca, why? Why didn't you tell me when you went abroad? Why?" Every time I think about it, I can't help but smile secretly, yet I feel a sense of melancholy because I know Robert would never ask me that. My dad occasionally mentions Robert as well. He asks me if I remember my desk mate. My dad said Robert was the top science student in the college entrance examination, and he mentioned that Robert and his mother came specifically to thank him. He said Robert doesn't like giving interviews, but that year, the only one he agreed to was to promote my dad's support for him. My father also mentioned that Robert had inquired about me, but he has always respected my privacy and did not provide him with my contact information. Later, Robert gave my father his phone number, asking him to pass it on to me, stating that I could reach out to him if I needed anything. However, by that time, 3 years had already passed, and all my feelings for Robert had faded. Additionally, I was engrossed in discovering niche artists with a group of friends, completely lost in that world, and eventually forgot about it. I did not contact Robert, nor did my father give him my phone number. Of course, I never thought of him again after that. I only vaguely recalled him when friends abroad asked if I had ever had a crush on someone. After all, it has been 9 years. Moreover, what I remember is not him as an individual, but rather the feelings I experienced when I was young and vaguely infatuated with someone, those bittersweet emotions. So, when I saw Robert again, I felt only a slight surprise. There were no other emotions. Robert entered behind the butler. After 9 years apart, he has changed quite a bit. Primarily, he is taller and more upright. His once youthful and handsome features have matured, with sharper brows and eyes. However, the previously ostentatious and arrogant demeanor has diminished significantly, and his overall aura has become more subdued and introspective, like a sharp sword sheathed in its scabbard. I know a little about him. He started a business in the digital economy after graduation, related to artificial intelligence, big data, and chips. I'm not very familiar with this field, but I saw his name on the list of China's top 10 rising wealthy individuals. He's the youngest but ranks the highest. He seemed to be lost in thought, so I decided to greet him first. I smiled, standing in the center of the living room, looking at Robert, and said, "Robert, long time no see." He stopped in his tracks, but for some reason, he didn't look up in my direction. He just stood there, stiff as if someone had paralyzed him. After a long time, he finally lifted his gaze towards me. I caught sight of his amber eyes once more, resembling a bottomless pool. I smiled at him again and politely remarked, "Robert, are you here to see my father?" "Thank you. Have you had something to eat yet?" This was merely a courteous statement, yet for some inexplicable reason, Robert continued to gaze at me with those fathomless eyes, and after a moment, he shook his head. I was momentarily taken aback, then instructed someone to prepare a simple meal. Later, after Robert had visited my father, I accompanied him to the dining room for a meal. As he was the guest, it would have been impolite to leave him unattended. He ate very slowly, casually chatting with me as if we were old friends. "When are you coming back?" I paused for a moment. It felt quite subtle because when Robert asked me this so naturally, it was as if we were transported back 9 years, to when he would return from gym class and find me secretly sneaking back to my seat. He would place the water he had brought for me on my desk while asking, "When did you sneak back?" I laughed and explained to him, "I just got back not long ago." He let out a sound and then went to pick up the silver noodles from the bowl. He ate 2 strands and then told me, "I just finished talking with Uncle Wu. I plan to relocate a business of the company back to City A and establish a new company to explore new markets." Initially, There will be about 2,000 employees. Coincidentally, Uncle Shin has a piece of land in the western suburbs, which has a pleasant environment. I plan to settle there. Are you going to buy that piece of land? I asked, somewhat surprised. That piece of land was purchased at a low price by my father years ago, originally because the scenery looked promising and there were plans for development. It is somewhat distant from the main urban area, but the government's planning has been delayed, and naturally, the investment has gone to waste. Robert grunted. I was at a loss for words. It was clear that this was a gesture of gratitude, but I didn't hesitate to accept it because I knew that with his current status and influence, he would undoubtedly find a way to make that piece of land valuable. So, I said thank you. He grunted again. I watched him pick up 2 strands of noodles. I remembered that he used to really enjoy eating noodles. Back then, when we went to the cafeteria for meals, I could never finish the usual bowl of noodles. So before eating, I would always use clean chopsticks to transfer a large portion of noodles from my bowl to Robert. He has always been able to eat completely clean. Perhaps it's due to the difference in status that he no longer enjoys eating noodles? I observed him chewing slowly and couldn't help but glance at my watch. It wasn't to rush him, but I had a contract to sign shortly. Robert is quite perceptive. With just this minor action, he noticed and asked me, "Do you have something planned for later?" I responded with a sound and informed him, "It's a batch of imported crude oil." My father had previously negotiated a contract with Iraq, and they scheduled me to review the contract this afternoon. Robert furrowed his brow, pondered for a moment, and reminded me, "Crude oil? Be sure the contract clearly states that the settlement basis must rely on the weight certificate issued by the inspection and quarantine at the unloading port." Seeing that I didn't understand, he explained to me, "Crude oil is a high-risk oil type with a significant water content, and I'm worried that the other party might take advantage of you, a young girl. If the water content exceeds the limit, it could explode. At that time, if it is not specified in the contract, all losses will be borne by you." He paused for a moment and added, "There's no guarantee that someone won't try to take advantage of this opportunity to tamper with things or take kickbacks." I suddenly realized and couldn't help but sincerely exclaim, "Robert, you know so much." He was taken aback for a moment, then suddenly laughed. That smile was like a clear sky after a storm, as if an iceberg had melted. Before he could speak, I already knew what he was laughing about. Back when I sat next to him, every time I asked him a question, whether in science or the humanities, he would explain it to me piece by piece until I understood. I would look at him with admiration and say in an odd tone, "Robert, you really know so much." I smiled as well. Now, there truly is no barrier between us. It feels as if we have returned to the time before those barriers were created. As time has passed, the conflicts of the past have been smoothed over, leaving only those beautiful memories. Robert quickly finished the bowl of noodles and stood up to say to me, "All right, you go ahead and get busy. I'll come back to talk to you and Uncle Shin about that piece of land in a while." He eats slowly, yet when he leaves, he does so without dragging his feet. I glanced at my watch and then stepped outside. Later, while reviewing the contract, my father's assistant confirmed everything. I recalled Robert's reminder and couldn't help but smile, then asked, "Wait a moment. I want to clarify whether the settlement basis in the contract specifies that it must be based on the weight certificate issued by the inspection and quarantine at the unloading port." The other party exchanged glances. I smiled, but my tone was very firm as I said, "If this clause is not included, we will not recognize this contract." After exiting, my father's assistant kept apologizing to me, saying it was fortunate I brought it up, and he explained that he had been so busy lately that he overlooked such an important detail. I observed his expression and, keeping a composed demeanor, greeted him, "Uncle, you are too kind. Recently, my father has been recuperating, and we are all depending on your efforts. Please make sure to rest well when you return." He wiped the sweat from his brow. When I mentioned this to my dad that evening, his expression darkened. After a prolonged silence, he sighed and said, "He has been with me for 12 years. I remained silent. However, shifting the conversation, my dad looked at me with pride and remarked, "Rebecca, you have truly matured. In my memory, You were still that little girl in my arms, sweetly asking for candy. Now you can stand on your own and understand people's hearts." He smiled and asked me, "Robert, that young man is indeed quite impressive. What is your current relationship with him?" I was initially moved by the first half of my father's words. I didn't even expect to respond so maturely, calmly, and steadily. However, when my father spoke the second half, I was left stunned. I retorted, "Robert, what kind of relationship could I possibly have with him?" My father laughed and shook his head, saying, "Oh, you young people just don't understand." After that, he seemed ready to rest, and I had no choice but to leave. Standing in the corridor, I gazed at the spiraling staircase below, feeling a sense of confusion that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Chapter 08. I began to see Robert frequently. After my father recovered significantly, he stopped going to the office and worked intermittently from home. Since I was quite familiar with Robert, he would often come over to visit my father. My father likely wanted to mentor me, as he always had me listen in during business discussions. I generally observed and listened more, speaking less. Then one day, while having dinner, my father suddenly laughed and asked Robert, "Hey Robert, I noticed in the financial news that your company has been quite active lately. With you being so busy, do you still have time to personally oversee the land matters in the western suburbs every day?" I instinctively glanced at Robert. Indeed, as the CEO of a tech company, it seems quite a waste for him to come here to discuss a land contract. Much like a CEO switching careers to manage logistics and administration, Robert was momentarily taken aback, but quickly replied without changing his expression, "This is fundamental to the new project, so I need to ensure everything is foolproof." My dad smiled quietly, saying nothing. "Once the major framework of the contract is established, I will need to handle the finer details." Robert was very generous, not bargaining at all, even offering a purchase price 40% above market value. My dad was well aware that Robert was repaying a favor, but in the end, my dad declined. Out of politeness, the premium portion was converted into Robert S. Company's options, written in my name. Because of this, my interactions with Robert are quite frequent. Robert is also quite strange. During school, he was taciturn. I'd say 10 sentences, and he would respond with just one. But now, I often receive messages from him. He tells me about the strange things he sees on the road, the business banquets he attends, and even when he travels abroad for work. Sometimes, he sends me his dinner or workout records. Eventually, I couldn't help but ask him, as the top newcomer on the rich list, "Are you really that free every day?" There was a long pause on the other end before he replied with 6 dots. "All right then, tit for tat." I occasionally share some of my daily life with him as well. He typically replies very quickly. If he takes more than an hour to respond, he always explains what he was doing. I believe I might know his daily schedule better than Robert's assistant does. Later, there was a time when he mentioned he was hosting a private gathering at home, just with close friends, and asked if I wanted to join. I happened to have some free time, so I decided to go. Robert's flat was different from what I had imagined. I have visited many of my friends' homes, and almost all of them are decorated to reflect their social status and aesthetic. But Robert's apartment is quite spacious yet clearly shows the lack of aesthetic sense typical of a science and engineering guy. When I arrived, his friends were already there. I recognized some of them as Robert's business partners. They all smiled at me and meaningfully asked, "Aw, we finally get to see the living Rebecca." I pretended not to understand. I also saw an acquaintance, Angelica. She was sitting in the center of the sofa, her face as exquisite as when I first met her, smiling and tilting her head to look at me. Then she waved and said, "Rebecca, it's been a long time." I was momentarily stunned and returned her smile. Robert probably heard the commotion. Wearing an apron and holding a knife in each hand, he came out, saw me smile, greeted me, and then went back inside to chop the filling. This private gathering is quite different from what I had imagined. A large group of newly minted big shots is personally making dumplings. Perhaps this is a way for tech guys to relieve stress. I don't quite understand it, but Angelica has clearly adapted. She smiled at me, familiar and cheerful, saying, "Don't worry, We don't have to do anything later. We just need to help make dumplings. I let out an "oh" and walked over to sit beside her. Just as I sat down, I heard Robert calling for me from the kitchen. I smiled helplessly at Angelica and then walked toward the kitchen under her meaningful gaze. Robert stood there with confidence, directing me to wash the Chinese cabbage, beat the eggs, and soak the vermicelli. I stood quietly beside him, lowering my head to wash the Chinese cabbage leaf by leaf, while he chopped the meat filling with vigor. Whenever I turned my head slightly, I could see the handsome, smooth contours of his profile. He smiled and asked me, "Do you think it looks good?" I responded with a "huh," and he, still smiling, continued to ask, "Do you think it looks good?" I nodded and said, "It's quite good looking." "Weren't you voted online as the most desirable bachelor among contemporary unmarried women?" After a brief pause, I added with a smile, "There's no one of them. Does that touch your heart?" He seemed to choke for a moment before replying, "No." As I washed the baby bok choy, I turned to look at him, somewhat puzzled. "What do you mean, no?" He lowered his head to chop the meat and said, "There are no women." I paused for a moment and gently said, "Isn't Angelica quite nice?" His hand paused in chopping the meat, and he looked at me curiously, saying, "We're just friends. And besides, she married Alex right after graduating from college, the one you mentioned when you walked in. The living Rebecca." Then he asked, "What about you? What about Martin?" I said, "Why should I talk to you?" He laughed. The force and sound of chopping meat noticeably increased. And he said, "Even if you don't talk to me, I know. A year ago, I saw the wedding photos on your Instagram where you were the bridesmaid, smiling like a flower." I was puzzled. "How do you know my Instagram account?" He simply pressed his lips together and fell silent, thumping away at the meat. "Fine. If you don't want to talk, then don't. I'll see how long you can hold it in. Anyway, I'm not in a hurry." After finishing the dumplings, the men busily cleaned up, washing dishes and tidying up, while Angelica and I lay on the sofa, rubbing our stuffed bellies. Angelica suddenly winked at me and asked, "Rebecca, would you like to go see Robert's collection?" I found myself intrigued. She led me to Robert's study, and as we entered, she suddenly recalled something and explained, "Don't misunderstand me. I'm so familiar with this place because we often hold meetings here." She pointed to a large blackboard at the back, covered with a chaotic array of data I couldn't comprehend, and remarked, "Robert's place is even more of a mess. It's ideal for brainstorming sessions when we want to wreak havoc." I smile. In fact, Robert's collection is not very extensive. It mainly consists of some trophies and certificates he has received, along with numerous photos of his awards and some traces of his growth. Angelica pulled out an album for me and accompanied me as I flipped through it, page by page. When I reached the middle, I suddenly paused, for there was a commemorative photo of Robert standing in front of Columbia University, expressionless, with a cold gaze, yet subtly appearing very sad. Angelica noticed me staring at that photo. She first glanced outside, then turned to me and said, "This was during his sophomore year when Robert applied for a week-long exchange at Columbia University." She paused and said to me seriously, "He is looking for you, Rebecca. I thought he would find you, but I don't know why. After returning from the United States, he has been downcast for a long time. I think maybe he didn't find you, or perhaps he did find you and you rejected him. To be honest, I have never really liked you. You didn't even inform Robert when you went abroad. I feel like you never considered him a friend. But Robert always says that he was the one who wronged you first. He pushed you away because of his youthful insecurities and poverty. It's his fault. There have been many girls who liked him over the years, but he has always been absent-minded. When he graduated from high school, he became the top science student, and we all celebrated him. I remember that the restaurant where we dined had a world map, and everyone was in high spirits. However, he stood in front of that map and asked me, "Angelica, how far is it from City A to Manhattan, New York? Can I catch up?" I saw Robert smile like that for the first time at your childhood friend's wedding a year ago. He mentioned that he had misunderstood. He thought his opportunity might have arrived. I believe that if it weren't for his commitments to the domestic business, he would have likely gone to find you immediately. When he first ventured into entrepreneurship, he was almost frantic. We all wondered why he was so relentless. He said he felt like a summer cicada, while the girl he admired was a bird, always flying to places he could never reach. He believed that only through immense effort could he hope to align himself with the trajectory of that bird. I listened in a daze until Angelica appraised me from head to toe, then smiled and asked, "What about you, Rebecca? What are your thoughts on Robert? Do you truly believe he is that cicada?" What am I thinking? To be honest, I feel somewhat lost. I had no idea there were so many stories behind this, like the courage he mustered to give my dad that phone number, like how he silently followed my Instagram, like how he flew to Manhattan to find me at Columbia University back then. I was completely unaware. At that time, Martin was always looking after me. I think when Robert mustered the courage to come find me, he must have seen Martin and misunderstood. However, there are some things I do know, such as how he came to see my dad as soon as he heard he was ill. His status is no longer ordinary. His market business development potential is enormous, and all the major banks give him face. For instance, he reminded me about my contract issues, helped my family resolve land problems, and reported his schedule to me daily, pulling me into his social circle. As Angelica and I emerged from the study one after the other, Robert stood up, looking somewhat tense as he glanced at me, then asked Angelica, "What did you show her?" Angelica, with her usual bright smile, replied, "Of course, I showed her your embarrassing moments." Robert chuckled. His demeanor was now calm and composed, a tranquility that came from habitual strategizing, the spirited confidence I recognized. He settled back onto the sofa and said with a smile, "Then let me see too. I don't recall having any embarrassing moments." Everyone in the room erupted in laughter. I observed Robert amid the laughter. He was handsome, with a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. I softly called out, "Robert." He quickly turned to me, his eyes reflecting my small shadow. He gently murmured, then quietly asked, "What's wrong?" I smiled faintly and remained silent. My heart was a damp mess, but not the dark kind of dampness. It felt as if my entire heart were submerged in water, rising and falling with an unreal sensation, filled with nostalgia, bitterness, heartache, and regret. In short, it was a complex blend of emotions. But I suppose it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's different from before. I still have plenty of time with him. I glanced at Robert beside me. He was listening to others talk, but his hands were subconsciously peeling a macadamia nut, which is my favorite nut, although I always find it troublesome to peel. I watched him, and sure enough, after peeling it, he instinctively handed it over to the left. I took it from his palm and then observed him naturally retract his hand to peel another one, from the habits formed in the first year of high school. He still hasn't changed them to this day. I smiled and placed the macadamia nut in my mouth. I believe it doesn't matter. Robert and I still have ample time ahead of us. I forgive that classmate Robert, who, in his youth, coldly declared his dislike for Rebecca to protect his pride, because I too disliked him for pushing me further away. We are even now. We can take our time. There is still plenty of time. The winds of our youth have only just begun to howl today.